we should keep the question of reform and revolution alive. I don't think it's a useless debate, because if you throw away the question of revolution, then you kind of accept any mainstream progress, as long as it's a progress, as long as, like, I was extremely hungry, my son is a bit less hungry, then it's we are doing good. um, I don't think we should embrace that framework. At the same time, we shouldn't be revolutionaries in the sense that as long as we don't have a socialist utopia, everything is same. Everything makes no sense.
Looking toward the future here, um, what's the record, you would say, of, on the one hand, the question on reform versus revolution, right? And even on your show recently, you had Prabhat Patnaik on to talk about socialism. Is socialism still relevant? Excellent conversation. Viewers should definitely check it out if they haven't already. But Prabhat Patnaik talks about sort of the dialectic of, between reform and revolution, and the debate of seeing reform versus revolution, as mutually exclusive is sort of outdated. And he advocates for how reform should be pursued within the current political framework with the horizon of revolution or of socialist transformation, and that these two are dialectically related. Um, so this question of, how do we evaluate, looking at the history of the left, the reform versus revolution and the dialectic between reform and revolution, that question.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, but I think the word dialectics is, as you refer to, is important, which means that it never goes away. I mean, in a purely Hegelian sense, if there is an antithesis to a thesis, even the synthesis become the antithesis of another thesis, right? And so that's how history progresses. And I think the question of reform revolution is can never be settled once and for all. There are only historical moments and conjunctures in which these questions find their meaning. So they can only be understood in terms of very specific context. But if we are to take a general position, I would say I would agree with Prabhat Patnaik, who said that um, a firm commitment to reform, and by reform we mean any step forward, any progressive step forward towards the kind of society that we would like to see, or let's say based on history, based on theory, reason, everything, we can imagine a future that is just, that is more just, let's say, because as Amartya Sen said that we'd never live to see a place which should be completely free of injustices. But nevertheless, there are often remediable justices, and those of us who are on the left talk about those remediable just injustices that can be remedied and that would lead to a more just society. So let's say any step forward in that direction, let's classify that or call that reform, right? um, if you What Prabhat said was, if you stay committed to that agenda, uh, eventually you would have to become more and more radical, because beyond the point, either you will have to give up on those commitments, or you will have to go beyond what is sometimes called as a traditional fold of reform. And he cited the example of Greece. So Syriza comes to power by making these commitments that we would not embrace austerity, we would not embrace this massive cuts in pensions and layoffs and so on and so forth. We'd also demand that the even to improve the bond market situation, that a lot of that loss has to be incurred by the European bankers, which had lent money not just to the state but private sector, who did terribly poorly. Um, uh, but they had to give up, and so the choice was they would either continue down that path, and that would have meant continuing with what Yanis Varoufakis and others were proposing, or what they ultimately did. They gave up on that. They stuck to a middle ground. Of course, now there are reports that Greece Greek economy did recover from that terrible mess, and now they are doing much better, which is true. But there are also enormous challenges. It relies a lot on tourism. There are not too many industrial jobs, and etc. Um, the yeah, the short answer is we should support policies and principles and politics that further people's rights, um, uh, while also remaining committed to see the dangers of it. So it shouldn't be a naive embrace. So some of the things would be like, what do you make of, one time payout of 5,000 rupees to farmers in India? Um, that's a classic reform versus revolution question in one sense. Now the whole middle class is agitating against it. So for them, you have to even pull back the 5,000 rupees. You have to even pull back the 75,000 one-time grant for housing. And all of us know that pulling back of that would, of course, improve your fiscal situation. But that would be a catastrophe for the consumption of the working class. Now, that would mean that you have no houses because banks are not lending them. The whole priority sector lending is a total farce. I mean, there are works on that that go, much of the priority sector lending loans goes to Hyderabad and Delhi because these are the front organization that corner this credit. So if you are a poor farmer, you don't get credit from the banks. And now, if you pull back the state levers, that would mean a tremendous austerity. So, as leftists, are we going to say that because these so-called freebies don't advance a very rigorous structural transformation, and which is true? I mean, they don't allow you to, they don't empower families in the way they have to be empowered. I mean, providing education that can actually make you make upward mobility, actually creating jobs through investments that can give you jobs, those would be more empowering policies, rather than giving a one-time grant for a housing, rather than giving 5,000 as pension. But are we going to oppose them? No, we will say that these are important. The National Food Security Act that gives you 35 kgs of rice is for a family of, let's say, five, is tremendously important to fight malnourishment and extreme hunger. Is that enough? Are we going to celebrate that as the champions of mainstream economics does? We are not, because we know that 35 kgs of rice is not enough to get you. Maybe it's enough to get you the overall calorie of 2,500 calorie a day, but it's not enough to meet the micronutrient requirement. So we are going to say that that's inadequate, but we are not going to say that that's useless. We're not going to say that the state should not maintain the food stocks by procurement, because the procurement enables the peasants to get a minimum support price. When the market price drops below the input cost, then the state comes in and procures them, and then the state redistributes them in the market to segments that desperately need it, but sometimes also to adjust the markets when there is a severe market condition. The state can release this food into the market and can stabilize prices. And many people, Jayati Ghosh, Max, Isabella Weber, Steve Keen, etc., these economists have been working on these things. So the basic point is that we should keep the question of reform and revolution alive. I don't think it's a useless debate, because if you throw away the question of revolution, then you kind of accept any mainstream progress, as long as it's a progress, as long as, like, I was extremely hungry, my son is a bit less hungry, then we are doing good. I don't think we should embrace that framework. At the same time, we shouldn't be revolutionaries in the sense that as long as we don't have a socialist utopia, everything is same. Everything makes no sense. Well, it's women should be liberated from families, or else it's a false liberation. it's a ridiculous thing to make. I mean that would not happen. But that question remains. That question has to remain alive as long as we would have to critique the existing structures of family. But that doesn't mean that real gains made by women are less important, because they are still stuck in maybe a bourgeois family structure. So I think it is not as much important to find a final resolution for the question of reform and revolution, because you can't. Uh, but it is important to keep the debate between reform and revolution alive, so that we can choose the best path for ourselves, so that we don't capitulate to the mainstream. Same is true for China. If you think that the reform and opening is only successful, then it would be hard for you to think about alternative strategies. If you think that the export-led growth is only successful, you would still think that we would keep on continuing part of export-led growth, while the global situation has changed, and you would have to innovate alternatives to the export-led growth. On the other hand, if you think that because export-led growth came at the cost of working class politics, and it was introducing market elements, it was inviting private capital, and so we should go back to that Maoist phase, that's totally ridiculous as well. So I think what we need as leftists, as innovative people, as people who actually read, actually engage with the real world, and actually are ready to look at evidence and then look at a future which is much more resonating, practical, innovative, also in the direction of the idealisms we hold, we should stop thinking about this one time solution. This is revolutionary, this is reformist. We can still debate. I think that is important. But beyond that, I think we shouldn't spend too much time, or we shouldn't engage in sectarianism that are useless. A lot of people engage in sectarianism that is used, and the left is not immune from that. And that's a bourgeois trend. That's a bourgeois trend, because if my opinion was not vetted in the Central Committee, I am out of view. Working class politics doesn't happen like that. I mean, we have all lived that life. You want to have your own reading table, but you have to share it with three siblings. Like it or not, you have to do it. And yes, you might have an opinion about what you like, but at the end of the day, it's all about compromising. And working class lives, working class cultures constitute of that compromises, where on one hand you put your demand about what you like, what you want, but on the other hand you can make a compromise for the sake of the greater good. Just as you compromise for the sake of the family, you have to compromise for the sake of the collective. And you can take this individualist position that, oh, just because my opinion didn't become the grand opinion, so there is no freedom of expression. I mean, freedom of expression is not the only thing. For a collective, they would have to come to a conclusion. For the states to be functional, they would have to adopt a policy. You cannot run into policy paralysis because 100 different people have 100 different visions. I mean, there has to be a democratic process through which you come at a single conclusion and then follow it. Nevertheless, remain very open to the results and then tweak it as far as the feedback loops kicks in. But you cannot say that just because my theoretical socialism didn't resemble the Soviet Union, I am going to castigate them as totalitarianism. Just because I don't like the markets, I would say that all the Chinese experiment is false and it is a capitalist transformation. I don't think that is helpful.